This is not the first time I've covered a sequel that followed from a franchise or a movie that came out decades ago, and all of a sudden, because of a certain trend within the film business, decide to come back. In the same way that Tron Legacy was birthed from the big revival of big budget sci-fi and the 3D explosion of the late 2000s, Superman Returns was birthed from what else? The resurgence of superhero movies in the 2000s, especially after Batman Begins, which pretty much revitalized Warner Brothers' comic book output to the movies. And of course, who else do they get but someone with a proven track record in the field? Bryan Singer, the man behind the first two X-Men films. And well, there's this whole development history about a ton of different scripts and ideas that had come and gone over the years since the last Superman movie, Quest for Peace, which brought in the likes of, say, Tim Burton and J.J. Abrams and Wolfgang Peterson over the years to try and resurrect the Man of Steel. One of which, Superman Lives, which was going to be the Tim Burton Kevin Smith project, is currently getting a really interesting documentary called The Death of Superman Lives, What Really Happened, which I'm very much looking forward to. But back to this, the game plan is to, well, revive the original Donner series. And to be fair, no matter what Returns would have done, it wouldn't have exactly had much competition when it came to the latest sequels to the Donner films. I mean, frankly, I doubt anyone with a straight face is going to honestly say that 3 and 4 were that worthwhile, and Returns, for all of its failings, at least is a lot more competent than those two. And with a $300 million price tag attached to it, what could possibly go wrong? At the very least, we should be dealing with something that is a sheer visual marvel and possibly one of the most beautiful comic book movies ever made, right? Right? Well, there's a very good quote that a YouTube user named Captain Logan, you might better know him as Geekvolution, did when he reviewed the film under his Superhero Rewind series. He described Superman Returns as a film that wants to be Donner's Superman, but it doesn't understand it. And I think that's what ultimately leads to this film having a very strange reputation. On the one hand, it wants to be like those original films from the late 70s and early 80s. It wants to be this big, grand epic. It's very slow burn. It's more about focusing in on the interplay between the characters instead of gigantic action set pieces. It wants to go back to that story of an alien cast from his own planet and trying to be the best he can for all of humanity, and it's still dealing with the people around him trying to fit him into their lives. But then on the other hand, you can definitely feel the influence of the then comic book movies, especially Batman Begins here. The film is much, much darker than either of the first two Donner films or any of the Lester films. It tries to paint this Superman, which is supposed to be the same character that Christopher Reeves plays, in a more morally ambiguous light, as a much more brooding, dour character. It wants to also ground this universe in a bit more of reality, and no longer is as lively or bubbly as those first two films were, and instead tones it down a lot. Even the big, crazy land scheme that Lex cooks up, which is more or less a take on the one from the first film, is a lot more somber and not played anywhere near as much for sort of classic serial hijinks. For me, and for a lot of people who saw this, those two sides just don't mesh well. It wants to be this very old-style summer movie, but it still wants to bring in that younger crowd. It does all these homages to the first two films, calling back scenes and little moments, like, say, Clark being on the farm and discovering his powers, or trying to use the set pieces and action, what little there is for a movie that was budgeted at $300 million, to be more sort of, special effects showpieces, rather than really being good action, or even that tense in their own right, and even calling back certain elements, like, say, the sort of charmingly awkward kind of relationship that Clark and Lois had in the originals, or Lex's crazy schemes, which don't really mesh well considering how much darker and more ruthless this version of the character is over the somewhat self-important klutz that Gene Hackman was. It's this fundamental divide in what Singer is trying to accomplish here that just leaves me really scratching my head as to what the end goal was here. Who was this film being made for? It sort of reminds me of films like Cabin Boy or Tarsem Singh's Mirror Mirror. It's a film that doesn't quite know who it's aimed at. Is it aimed at the fans of the original Superman films? Because all this retreading and rehashing, they're not going to find that interesting. They already have seen those films millions of times on TV, video, and DVD. Why do they need to see it upscale with pretty new actors and CGI effects? They can just go back to those films if they want that core experience. Is it for the new kids and the people who never grew up with this? I would be tempted to say yes, but there's too many moments here where Singer literally stops the story to have some kind of callback or throwback to the earlier films, so people who don't know them are just going to be sitting there going, okay, are we going to go anywhere? Is this going anywhere? Does this have a point? And it just doesn't feel like enough was thought through here. On paper, trying to find that mid-ground would have been a nice approach, but the film just doesn't have that. It's just in two camps, and it doesn't know how to reconcile the two together. And unfortunately, the lesser aspects of this merger do make out to be its most prominent characteristics. The pace is unbelievably slow for what should be a relatively brisk affair, especially compared to, again, the Donner films, which, though they were long and were intended to be one giant epic, they moved along really well, and you actually got a good combination of being able to constantly keep the audience engaged, but also keeping them well informed and up to date of where the story was going. Here, Singer isn't quite as masterful with that, and a lot of scenes just feel like they drag, or they're just there for him to show off some kind of new little trick, be it in the CGI or in some kind of camera trick. There's an especially glaring shot where Superman just is floating in space because he needs to listen out for Lois, even though he doesn't need to go to space for that. Because reasons, I guess. Or an incredibly bizarre and out-of-character moment where Superman decides to use his X-ray vision to spy on Lois. Because that's what the Christopher Reeve one would do, right? That for me is the big problem, is just that there isn't that sense of a consistency there. The Reeve Superman was a grey, fun-loving, but also very stern kind of character. He was somebody you wanted to look up to, and even though he had his flaws, he always got past them and was proactive and was determined to help people out. The Brandon Routh Superman, who's supposed to be the same character, doesn't really fit that mold. He's a little too dark and brooding here, but it doesn't really make sense in the context of the series that this is supposedly continuing from. Remember, a huge bit part of his arcs in the first two films were him being able to get past the whole Kryptonian thing and being able to ultimately understand what his purpose was and being able to be that beacon for humanity, to put himself above others and to ultimately be willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good of man and show them the way, as Jor-El once said. This Superman just comes across as incredibly petty, and it just doesn't fit well. He's already been through this whole putting yourself before others arc. He's already been through the whole thing with deciding if she had a relationship with Lois Lane before. And what's more, he's already been over the Krypton thing for a while now. Why the hell is he brooding about the fact that he couldn't find it? He already knew it was dead, and he had already had to face the realities of that and moving past that. Wasn't a huge part of Superman 2 him learning to move on past his emotions and to ultimately put them aside in the service of the greater good? Why is this Superman suddenly so concerned about that when he's already had a good few movies to get past that, and the whole point of them was to get past that? Why are we going back to square one again? And speaking of out of character moments, there are just things here and there that I can't quite buy the Donner Superman doing. Again, Routh is supposed to be the same guy. Like knocking up Lois and giving her a child and then leaving without knowing. And then in the end having the balls to say, "Oh well, son, I will watch on you from a distance and no one must ever know what you are." Buddy, there's a big difference between you and what happened with Jor-El and then you and your son now. Jor-El died. You're still here. You don't have an excuse not to help this kid out, or at least help him get adjusted. And the kid has powers. The movie showed us in no uncertain terms. Why does Superman think it's a good idea to just let him be raised by human parents who may not be able to help him out when times go bad? Especially considering that puberty is right around the door for the kid, so what happens then with his powers? Superman's already been through all this. Surely he must know what his son will face, and shouldn't he be there in a more practical and parental way? I'm not saying take the kid away to the Fortress of Solitude yet, but at least be there in a greater capacity rather than saying, oops, oh well, phew. Again, that doesn't strike me as something that the Donner Superman would do, or even for that matter having sex with Lois outside of wedlock. It just doesn't quite fit. They were in a relationship, sure, but again, in Superman 2, a huge part of it was him learning to move past little things and to ultimately make tough choices. This Superman never strikes me as that, and whatever choices he makes feel more like cop-outs rather than the hard facts. And again, it's sort of this thing of Singer not quite knowing what he wants to do with it. This feels like it was rewritten a bunch of times and ultimately they just assembled the best parts or whatever they liked from them, and it just doesn't quite flow properly. Again, nothing wrong with going back to the roots, but at least have a sense of what you want to do beyond just nostalgia honoring. And it's a pity because there are good elements here. Granted, the casting logic doesn't make much sense because they hired Brandon Routh because he kind of looks like Christopher Reeve, but then none of the other actors look like their original counterparts, like Spacey doesn't look like Gene Hackman, or Kate Bosworth doesn't look like Margot Kidder. But they all do fine. I kind of feel sorry for Brandon that he got lumbered with a film like this because he actually did an okay job. And, well, Spacey is a ton of fun. I don't need to quote the meme because you all heard it a million times before. John Ottman's score is actually really good. I like his updating of the Williams theme while also keeping in a sort of grand style that is also at points very touching and intimate. And the production values, ignoring again the palette that they blatantly stole from Batman Begins, actually are not half bad. The plane sequence in particular is actually really well handled, and it gives you a sense of what this film could have been if they just had a more consistent vision. Sure, Man of Steel may have had its issues, it may have had a few pacing hiccups, and yes, the ending was a bit of a tone shift, but all in all, at least Snyder, Nolan, and Goyer had a sense of where they wanted to go and what the whole game plan was going to be for that movie. Throughout, it's story and tonally consistent, whereas this just seems to jump gears almost near continuously and never feels like it quite knows what it wants to do or say with this character. And even some of the more harsh and darker elements in Man of Steel at least were justified by the fact that, well, it was that Superman's first big adventure, so of course he's going to make mistakes and do things wrong, and well, he had a much more dangerous adversary in Michael Shannon Zod than this Superman does in Kevin Spacey's Luthor.